Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because every time you do, somewhere in the galaxy, an alien realizes they've underestimated humanity. Let's dive in. The Stellar Crown Academy stood like a testament to interspecies cooperation, which was rather ironic considering most of its students spent their time learning increasingly creative ways to dismember each other. Located on the neutral moon of Haven's Rest, the Academy boasted the finest military training facilities in 3-star systems, complete with gravity adjusters, atmospheric processors, and enough safety equipment to make a Terran insurance adjuster weep with joy. Of course, when your student body includes species that can phase through solid matter, manipulate crystalline structures with their minds, and project energy beams from their fingertips, safety becomes a relative concept. The Academy's designers had thoughtfully installed energy dampeners, kinetic barriers, and emergency medical stations every 50 meters. They had not, however, anticipated enrolling a human commander. Thraction clicked his mandibles in what passed for contemplation among his kind as he reviewed the latest incident reports. His chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the office's artificial lighting, and his compound eyes reflected the holographic displays showing training facility damage assessments. 3 sparring mats completely destroyed, 2 gravity generators offline, and 1 very confused maintenance crew trying to figure out how a punching bag had ended up embedded in a reinforced wall. "Explain to me again," he buzzed to his aide, Lieutenant Korvik, "how a single first-year student managed to cause more property damage in 1 semester than the previous graduating class combined." Korvik's antennae twitched nervously. "Well, sir, the human doesn't seem to understand the concept of restraint during training exercises. The human has a name, Lieutenant. Sarah Chun, sir. Though the other students have taken to calling her Bulldozer." Thraction's mandibles clicked faster, a sure sign of mounting irritation. "And why, pray tell, do they call her that?" "Because she moves like one, sir, and has roughly the same stopping power." The commander pulled up Chun's file, watching her holographic image rotate slowly above his desk. She appeared deceptively ordinary for a Deathworlder, average height by human standards, stocky build, short-cropped auburn hair, and the kind of casual smile that suggested she found the universe mildly amusing. Her psychological profile indicated high intelligence, adaptability, and what the Terran military euphemistically called aggressive problem-solving tendencies. "Her test scores are impressive," Thraction admitted grudgingly. "Top 5% in tactical analysis, mechanical aptitude through the ceiling, and her linguistic adaptation is remarkable. She's already fluent in standard Galactic and picking up Karathi high speech." "Yes, sir. The Karathi find that particularly offensive." "Of course they do." The commander closed the file with a gesture. "Schedule a meeting with Chun. I want to understand what we're dealing with before she accidentally levels the entire complex." Meanwhile, in Training Complex 12, Sarah Chun was having what she considered a perfectly normal workout session. The other students huddled safely behind reinforced barriers might have disagreed. She'd started with basic calisthenics, push-ups, sit-ups, jumping jacks, the kind of routine that would barely qualify as a warm-up back home. Unfortunately, nobody had bothered to explain to the facility sensors that human exercise patterns weren't meant to trigger emergency protocols. "Warning, seismic activity detected in Training Complex 12, announced the facility's AI in its maddeningly calm voice. "Initiating structural integrity scan." Sarah paused mid-burpee, sweat beading on her forehead despite the climate control. "It's just me, Arya, doing human things." Clarification requested. "Are human things a form of tectonic warfare?" "Only on Tuesdays." She resumed her workout, blissfully unaware that her routine was being broadcast live to the Academy's Xenobiology department as a case study in Deathworld physiology. Professor Villana, a willowy Etherian with the ability to phase shift through solid matter, watched in fascination as Sarah completed her third set of pull-ups on a bar, rated for twice her body weight. "Remarkable," the professor murmured to her research assistant. "Notice how she maintains perfect form, even as the gravitational resistance increases. Most species would struggle to adapt to the variable G training environment." "Professor," the assistant ventured, "shouldn't we inform her that the gravity intersection is set to 1.3 standard? That's the advanced level." "Good point. Aria, what gravity setting is Chun currently training under?" "Current gravitational constant in training complex 12, 1.7 standard." Vilana's phase-shifted form flickered with surprise. "That's the elite level setting. How long has she been training under those conditions?" "Since her arrival 6 weeks ago." The human requested something closer to home. The professor made a note to add this to her growing file on human adaptability. She had initially dismissed the rumors about Deathworlder capabilities as typical frontier world braggadocio. But Chun was proving to be a fascinating case study. The human's casual dismissal of environmental challenges that would incapacitate most species suggested that Earth's classification as a Class 10 death world might actually be conservative. Back in the training complex, Sarah had moved on to combat practice. The Academy's combat training philosophy emphasized what they called civilized warfare, energy weapons, force fields, and precise technical fighting styles that minimized physical contact. It was all very elegant, very refined, and absolutely nothing like the hand-to-hand combat training that had been drilled into her since childhood. She stood before a training dummy designed to simulate Karathi physiology, studying its crystalline structure and trying to remember the instructor's lecture about appropriate force application. The Karathi were proud of their combat traditions, viewing warfare as an art form that combined grace, precision, and overwhelming technological superiority. Their fighting style emphasized distance, control, and what they called elegant solutions to crude problems. Sarah threw a punch. The dummy exploded. Not dramatically, there was no fireball or shower of sparks. It simply ceased to exist as a coherent structure. Its crystalline matrix unable to absorb the kinetic energy of what the human considered a gentle tap. Fragments scattered across the training mat, and several emergency sensors began chiming simultaneously. "Warning, training equipment failure detected. Dispatching maintenance team." "I barely touched it," Sarah muttered, examining her knuckles for damage. Finding none, she shrugged and moved to the next dummy. This one was designed to simulate Draknari physiology dense, energy-resistant hide, capable of withstanding plasma bursts. She decided to try a different approach, opting for what her old drill instructor would have called a love tap to the solar plexus. The dummy folded in half. Okay, that's definitely not supposed to happen. By the time the maintenance team arrived, Sarah had worked her way through 6 different training dummies, each one representing a different alien species, and each one thoroughly defeated by increasingly gentle applications of human combat techniques. The maintenance chief, a long-suffering Grundig named Borak, surveyed the wreckage with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many equipment malfunctions in recent weeks. "Let me guess," he rumbled in his species' characteristic bass. "Growl, the human was here." "I was trying to be careful," Sarah protested. "Is that careful or human careful? Is there a difference?" Borak gestured at the scattered remains of what had once been 6 expensive training dummies. Apparently, the maintenance team went to work with practiced efficiency while Sarah retreated to the observation deck, where other students had gathered to watch the daily spectacle of human exercise. The group included representatives from most of the Academy species, a cluster of nervous Etherians who kept phase-shifting whenever Sarah looked in their direction, several Karathi maintaining their characteristic air of crystalline superiority, and a handful of Draknari who seemed torn between professional interest and existential dread. "She's getting stronger," whispered Malix. a second-year Karathi whose family had held military positions for 17 generations. His translucent skin had taken on the deep blue hue that indicated stress, and his internal light patterns flickered erratically. "That's impossible," replied his companion Nexian. "She's only been here 6 weeks. Physical adaptation takes cycles of training. Tell that to the training equipment." They watched in fascination as Sarah began her cool-down routine, which consisted mainly of light stretching and what appeared to be casual conversation with the maintenance team. The humans' easy camaraderie with the working class. Grundig was another source of bewilderment for the more aristocratic students, who maintained strict social hierarchies even in academic settings. "I heard she arm-wrestled Borak last week." Malix continued. "Beat him in under 30 seconds. "Impossible. The Grundig are renowned for their physical strength. He's been treating her with religious reverence ever since." Indeed, Borak had developed what could only be described as a crush on the human, though he'd vehemently deny it if asked. In his culture, physical prowess was the highest virtue, and anyone who could casually outmuscle a member of his species while maintaining perfect politeness deserved respect. The fact that she'd bought drinks for his entire crew afterward had cemented her status as a figure of near-mythical proportions in the maintenance department. As the training session wound down, students began filtering back to their dormitories. But one figure remained on the observation deck. Zarin Korath stood with the fluid grace characteristic of highborn Karathi, his crystalline features set in an expression of aristocratic disdain. Unlike the younger students who mixed fear with fascination when observing the human, Zarin regarded Chun with the cold calculation of someone who viewed her success as a personal affront. The Korath family had maintained their position in Karathi society for over 3 millennia, their name synonymous with military excellence and cultural refinement. Zarin had arrived at the academy expecting to add another chapter to his family's legacy, perhaps even earning the coveted designation of Prime Exemplar, the highest honor available to academy graduates. Then a Deathworlder had shown up and started breaking everything. It wasn't just the training equipment, though that was irritating enough. Chun's casual disregard for the academy's carefully structured social hierarchy threatened everything Zarin understood about proper order. She spoke to maintenance staff as equals, showed no deference to upper-year students, and worst of all, seemed genuinely oblivious to the complex web of species-based social expectations that governed academy life. "Barbarian," he muttered in high Karathi, his internal bioluminescence pulsing with barely contained irritation. Unfortunately for Zarin's sense of superiority, Sarah had indeed been studying high Karathi, and her linguistic adaptation was even better than her file suggested. She glanced up at the observation deck and offered a cheerful wave. "Thanks for watching," she called out in perfectly accented high Karathi. "Hope you picked up some tips." Zarin's bioluminescence flared bright enough to illuminate the entire observation deck, a reaction that among his species indicated either extreme embarrassment or homicidal rage, possibly both. As he stalked away, crystalline fingers clenched into fists, Zarin began formulating plans. The Academy's Grand Combat Tournament was only weeks away, a formal competition where students could demonstrate their combat prowess in front of military recruiters and family representatives. It would be the perfect venue to remind everyone exactly what separated civilized species from Deathworld barbarians. Down in the training complex, Sarah finished her stretches and gathered her gear, blissfully unaware that she'd just made an enemy. In her experience, people who took themselves too seriously usually worked out their issues eventually. After all, how much trouble could one aristocratic alien cause? The Academy's evening meal period proceeded with its usual carefully orchestrated chaos, as hundreds of students from dozens of species attempted to navigate the complex social dynamics of interspecies dining. The cafeteria had been designed by committee, which explained why it resembled a 3-dimensional maze, crossed with a diplomatic reception hall. Different atmospheric zones accommodated various breathing requirements, while specialized food dispensers catered to everything from photosynthetic Etherians to the carnivorous apex hunters from the rim worlds. Sarah had found her usual spot. At one of the neutral zone tables designed for species with similar environmental needs. She'd learned to avoid the Karathi section after an unfortunate incident involving what she thought was seasoning, but turned out to be a mild neurotoxin. And the less said about her encounter with Etherian cuisine, the better. Chun. Borok's voice boomed across the cafeteria as the Grundig maintenance chief approached with his evening meal, a slab of protein that looked like it could double as body armor. Heard you cracked the floor in 12 today. Complete accident. Sarah replied around a mouthful of what the dispensers optimistically labeled Terran-style nutrition paste. I was just doing some light cardio. Light cardio, Borok repeated, his tusks gleaming with amusement. You know the engineering specs on that flooring? Rated to withstand direct plasma cannon fire. Maybe it was defective. Or maybe humans are scarier than anyone wants to admit. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Professor Villana, whose phase-shifted form solidified into visibility as she approached their table. The Etherian academic carried herself with the dignity befitting her position, though Sarah noticed she maintained a respectful distance, something most of the faculty had learned to do after the great sparring incident of week 3. Miss Chun, the professor began, her voice carrying the melodic quality common to her species. I was hoping to discuss your participation in our upcoming Xenobiology Symposium, the one about Deathworld adaptation patterns? Precisely. Your presence here has provided invaluable data for our research into species integration. We're particularly interested in your psychological adaptation to low-threat environments. Sarah blinked. Low threat? Well, yes. Compared to your homeworld's environmental challenges, the Academy's training regimen must seem quite manageable. Borok snorted, nearly choking on his protein slab. Tell that to the training equipment. Professor Villana's phase-shifted form flickered, with what might have been embarrassment. Yes, well, we're still calibrating our understanding of human physical capabilities. Perhaps you could provide some baseline measurements for our research. Sure, Sarah agreed. What did you have in mind? Nothing too strenuous. Basic strength assessment, reflexive response testing, perhaps a demonstration of your species' combat techniques under controlled conditions. Sounds reasonable. When do you want to start? How about tomorrow? We've prepared a special testing facility with upgraded safety protocols. As the professor phase shifted away, Borok leaned closer to Sarah with a conspiratorial whisper. You know she's been taking bets on how much damage you'll cause, right? Really? Smart money's on total facility replacement. I put 50 credits. On interdimensional breach. Sarah laughed, unaware that across the cafeteria, Zarin Korith was watching their interaction with growing irritation. The announcement of the Grand Combat Tournament arrived with all the pomp and circumstance that military academies seem to require for everything, including cafeteria menu changes. Commander Thraction stood at the podium in the main auditorium, his chitinous form gleaming under the ceremonial lighting while hundreds of students from dozens of species filled the amphitheater-style seating. The Grand Combat Tournament, he buzzed with appropriate gravitas, represents the pinnacle of academic achievement. Here you will demonstrate not merely your combat prowess, but your understanding of civilized warfare principles. Sarah sat in the back row, quietly eating what the dispensers called breakfast, but looked suspiciously like recycled cardboard. Around her, students whispered excitedly about the tournament's prestige, the attending military recruiters, and the substantial prize funding provided by various species defense ministries. Combat will be conducted according to standard galactic protocols, Thraction continued. Energy dampeners will ensure non-lethal engagement. Medical teams will monitor all participants, and victory conditions will be determined by our advanced AI scoring system. Professor Villana materialized beside Sarah's seat, her phase-shifted form causing several nearby students to jump. "Miss Chun, have you considered entering the tournament?" "Not really," Sarah replied around a mouthful of breakfast paste. "Seems like everyone else has been training for this their whole lives." "Perhaps, but you've shown remarkable adaptability. Besides, the research data would be invaluable." Down on the stage, Commander Thrachin was explaining the tournament structure. Preliminary rounds would narrow the field to 16 competitors, followed by elimination brackets leading to the final championship match. Winners would receive military commendations, scholarship opportunities, and most importantly, bragging rights that could last entire careers. "Registration closes at the end of this week," the commander announced. "Remember, this tournament represents not just personal achievement, but the honor of your respective species." The auditorium erupted into excited chatter as students began forming training groups and discussing strategies. Sarah noticed that several conversations had suddenly gone quiet, with participants glancing in her direction with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright terror. "I think they're worried about you entering," Professor Villana observed. "Why? I'm just a first-year student." "You're also the student who accidentally destroyed 6 training dummies yesterday," Cracked reinforced. "Flooring, and somehow managed to arm wrestle a Grundig into submission." "That was friendly competition. Borak is still telling anyone who'll listen that you're blessed by the machine spirits." Over the next few days, the academy buzzed with tournament preparation. Training complexes operated around the clock as students practiced their species' traditional combat forms. The Karathi worked on their crystalline blade techniques, elegant movements that combined martial artistry with technological precision. Etherians practiced phase-shifting combat, learning to materialize at precisely the right moment to deliver devastating attacks. Draknari students focused on energy projection, creating elaborate light shows that doubled as lethal weapon displays. Sarah, meanwhile, continued her usual routine of accidentally breaking equipment while trying to understand alien combat philosophy. She'd registered for the tournament almost as an afterthought, mainly because Professor Villana had offered extra credit for participating in her ongoing research project. "The key to Karathi combat," explained Master Instructor Vorthik during a specialized seminar, "lies in the harmony between technology and technique. Our crystalline matrices amplify natural abilities while maintaining perfect control." He demonstrated with fluid grace, his translucent form shifting through a complex kata that incorporated energy manipulation, environmental adaptation, and what looked like interpretive dance. Crystalline formations erupted from the floor in response to his movements, creating temporary weapons and defensive barriers that dissolved and reformed in perfect synchronization. "Beautiful," breathed several students. Sarah raised her hand. "What happens if someone just punches through the crystal?" The instructor's bioluminescence flickered with confusion. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "The crystalline formations. What if an opponent uses direct kinetic force instead of trying to match your energy patterns?" "That would be crude, inelegant. No civilized fighter would attempt such a barbaric approach." "But would it work?" Master Vorthek's internal light patterns shifted to indicate mild offense. "Miss Chun, Karathi combat techniques have been refined over millennia. They represent the pinnacle of civilized warfare." "Sure, but I'm asking about the physics. Crystal structures have specific fracture points, right? Apply enough force at the right angle, and they'll shatter regardless of the energy matrix." The uncomfortable silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Zaran Korath's sharp intake of breath. The young noble had been watching the exchange with growing indignation, his aristocratic features set in an expression of barely contained outrage. "Perhaps," he said, rising from his seat with fluid grace. Some students would benefit from a practical demonstration of why traditional techniques have endured. Master Vorthic's mandibles clicked nervously. Mr. Korath, I formally request a training bout with Miss Chun, to demonstrate proper form, of course. The training hall went dead silent. Formal training requests were serious business. At the academy, carrying implications that went far beyond simple sparring matches. They were typically used to resolve disputes between students of different species, and declining such a request was considered a significant loss of face. Sarah looked around the suddenly tense room, noting the mixture of excitement and horror on her classmates' faces. Sure, why not? If Master Vorthic had possessed human facial expressions, he would have been visibly sweating. Instead, his chitinous features simply twitched with barely controlled panic as he began setting up the formal sparring protocols. Energy dampeners were activated, medical teams were summoned, and the Academy's AI began recording everything for later analysis. Standard rules apply, the instructor announced, his voice carrying none of its usual confidence. Victory conditions: submission, incapacitation, or judge's decision. Combat will continue until one participant yields or medical intervention is required. Zarin moved to the center of the training mat with predatory grace, his crystalline features glowing with anticipation. This was his element formal combat governed by rules and traditions that favored technical skill over crude strength. He'd spent years mastering the elegant techniques of his people, learning to channel energy through crystalline matrices with surgical precision. Sarah stepped onto the mat with considerably less ceremony, rolling her shoulders to work out the kinks. From sitting through the morning's lectures, she looked distinctly underdressed for formal combat, wearing standard academy training gear instead of the ceremonial equipment favored by most species. Begin when ready, Master Vorthic announced, retreating to what he hoped was a safe distance. Zarin immediately launched into his opening sequence, a flowing combination of movements that caused crystalline spears to erupt from the training mat around Sarah's position. The technique was flawless, textbook Karathi combat that would have impressed military instructors from here to the core worlds. Sarah sidestepped the first spear, ducked under the second, and casually snapped the third one in half with her bare hand. The training hall erupted into shocked murmurs as fragments of shattered crystal scattered across the mat. Zarin's bioluminescence flared with surprise and indignation as his perfect technique was dismissed with what appeared to be casual contempt. Impossible, he breathed, reforming his crystalline weapons with increasing desperation. Those matrices are reinforced with quantum-bonded molecular structures. Yeah, they're pretty tough, Sarah agreed, examining the crystal fragment in her hand. But they're still just crystals. What followed could hardly be called a fight. Zarin threw everything he had at the human advanced techniques that represented centuries of Karathi military tradition, energy manipulations that should have been overwhelming for any first-year student, and combat forms that had earned him recognition. As one of the most promising young warriors of his generation, Sarah treated it like a particularly interesting puzzle. She didn't fight so much as adapt, studying each new technique just long enough to understand its principles before finding the most efficient way to counter it. When Zarin created energy barriers, she found weak points in their construction. When he launched projectile attacks, she simply moved to where they weren't. When he attempted to trap her with complex crystalline formations, she broke them with precise applications of force that turned elegant structures into expensive debris. "This is fascinating," Professor Villana whispered to her research assistant. "Notice how she's not actually fighting him. She's deconstructing his techniques in real time." "Should we stop this?" the assistant asked nervously. "Are you insane? The data we're collecting here will revolutionize our understanding of adaptive combat psychology." By the time Master Vorthic finally called a halt to the demonstration, Zarin was breathing heavily, his internal bioluminescence flickering erratically with exhaustion and frustration. The training mat looked like a crystal mine had exploded, littered with the fragments of his shattered techniques. Sarah, meanwhile, looked mildly winded but otherwise unaffected by the experience. "Well," she said, offering Zarin a hand up, "that was educational. Thanks for the demonstration." The young Karathi noble stared at her outstretched hand as if it were a venomous snake. The casual offer of assistance, the complete lack of acknowledgement for his superior breeding and training, the dismissive tone that suggested she viewed their formal combat as nothing more than a learning exercise, it was all too much. "This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying a cold fury that made several nearby students step back involuntarily. Sarah shrugged. "Okay. Same time tomorrow?" The Grand Combat Tournament Finals arrived with enough ceremony to make a diplomatic summit jealous. The main arena had been transformed into a gladiatorial spectacle, complete with holographic displays, multi-species commentary teams, and betting pools that had somehow become an unofficial academy tradition. Military recruiters filled the VIP sections while students packed the general seating, their excitement creating a cacophony of clicks, buzzes, chirps, and various untranslatable vocalizations. Commander Thraction stood at the center of the arena, his ceremonial armor gleaming under the spotlights. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted sentient beings, welcome to the final match of this year's Grand Combat Tournament." The crowd erupted as Zarin Korath made his entrance, crystalline form practically radiating aristocratic confidence. He'd spent the intervening weeks in intensive training, refining techniques that dated back to the founding of Karathi civilization. His family's ancient combat armor had been specially modified for the occasion, each crystalline plate inscribed with honor, marks representing 17 generations of military excellence. Sarah's entrance was considerably less dramatic. She jogged into the arena wearing standard training gear, waving cheerfully at Borak and his maintenance crew, who'd claimed the best seats in the house. The Grundig chief held up a sign reading "Bulldozer smashes pretty rocks" in 5 different languages. "Our finalists represent a fascinating study in contrasts," announced Professor Villana from the commentary booth. Zarin Korath embodies centuries of refined Karathi combat tradition, while Sarah Chun brings the unpredictable adaptability characteristic of Deathworld species. "Translation," muttered her co-commentator, a gruff Drakmari veteran named Grimlock. "The Crystal Boys got fancy moves, and the humans going to break something expensive." The preliminary rituals began with Zarin performing the traditional Karathi Katu, a flowing sequence of movements that demonstrated perfect harmony between warrior and weapon. Crystalline formations erupted around him in precise geometric patterns, each one dissolving and reforming in perfect synchronization with his movements. Sarah spent the same time doing jumping jacks. "Unusual warm-up technique," Professor Villana observed diplomatically. "She's loosening up her shoulders," Grimlock replied. "Smart. Crystal Boys got reach advantage." When the match officially began, Zarin immediately launched into his most sophisticated technique, the prismatic convergence, a combat form that created multiple crystalline duplicates while channeling energy attacks through quantum-folded space. It was beautiful, elegant, and according to military textbooks, completely unstoppable. Sarah watched the light show with obvious interest, head tilted like she was solving a particularly engaging math problem. When the energy beams converged on her position, she simply wasn't there anymore, having sidestepped with the casual efficiency of someone avoiding a puddle. "Fascinating adaptation speed," the professor noted. "She's treating this as a learning exercise rather than combat." Zarin's frustration mounted as technique after technique failed to connect. The human moved with maddening efficiency, never where his attacks landed, never responding with the crude counterattacks he'd prepared for. She seemed genuinely curious about his abilities, studying each new technique with academic interest before finding its obvious weaknesses. The turning point came when Zarin abandoned elegance for desperation. His family's honor demanded victory. His species' reputation required dominance, and his personal pride could not tolerate defeat by a barbaric Deathworlder. In a moment of crystalline clarity, he realized that traditional techniques were insufficient. He would have to get his hands dirty. The grab happened faster than most species could track. Zarin phase shifted through his own crystalline barriers, abandoning defensive positioning for a direct assault on Sarah's throat. It was crude, inelegant, and completely contrary to everything Karathi combat philosophy represented. It was also the worst mistake of his life. Sarah's response was pure human reflex, a textbook grappling counter that her drill instructors had beaten into muscle memory through 10,000 repetitions. She didn't think, didn't plan, didn't consider the relative fragility of crystalline bone structure compared to human skeletal systems. She just moved. The sound that echoed through the arena defied easy description. Part crack, part crystalline. Chime, part structural collapse. Zarin's collarbone, a delicate lattice of quantum-bonded crystal. Designed for elegance rather than impact. Resistance simply ceased to exist as a coherent structure. The young Karathi's scream cut through the sudden silence like a thermal lance through tissue paper. Medical emergency in the arena, the AI announced with its customary calm, dispatching trauma teams. Sarah stood over her opponent, looking genuinely confused. Did I do something wrong? I thought this was supposed to be non-contact sparring. In the commentary booth, Professor Villana was frantically updating her research notes while Grimlock muttered something unprintable in 3 different languages. Well, the Draknari veteran finally said, that's definitely going in the textbooks. The arena fell silent except for Zarin's whimpering and the approaching sirens of emergency medical vehicles. Sarah knelt beside her opponent, her expression shifting from confusion to concern as she realized the extent of his injury. Hey, medical's on the way, she said gently. Try not to move too much. Zarin looked up at her through tears of pain and humiliation, seeing not the savage Deathworlder of his imagination, but someone genuinely worried about his well-being. The realization was somehow worse than the physical agony. He had challenged a human to prove Karathi superiority. Instead, he had learned the difference between combat as art and combat as survival. The medical bay at Stellar Crown Academy had seen its share of training injuries over the years. Energy burns, phase shift displacement syndrome, the occasional crystalline matrix overload, but nothing quite like the structural collapse of a Karathi's primary skeletal support system. Dr. Helix, the facility's chief medical officer, stood over Zarin's bio-regeneration pod with the expression of someone trying to solve a 3-dimensional puzzle while blindfolded. Fascinating, she murmured, her serpentine form coiling around the diagnostic displays. The fracture pattern suggests instantaneous stress distribution across multiple quantum-bonded crystal matrices. What kind of force could cause this type of damage? Human, replied her assistant, a young Etherean whose nervousness kept making him flicker in and out of visibility. Be more specific. One human applied standard grappling technique, duration approximately 0.3 seconds. Dr. Helix's scales shifted to a color that indicated profound skepticism. That's impossible. Karathi bone structure is specifically designed to withstand energy weapon discharge. No biological force could. She paused, reviewing the diagnostic data with growing amazement. The injury was surgically precise, targeting exactly the stress points that would cause maximum structural failure with minimum applied force. It was as if the human had somehow identified the most vulnerable aspects of crystalline architecture and exploited them with textbook efficiency. Has anyone interviewed the human about her combat training? The doctor asked. Miss Chun is in the waiting area. Claims it was a basic defensive maneuver and keeps asking if Mr. Korath will be okay. Down the corridor, Sarah sat in what the academy generously called a waiting room, but more closely resembled an alien furniture exhibition. Chairs designed for species with vastly different anatomies created a seating arrangement that defied both logic and comfort. She'd eventually given up trying to find something human-appropriate and settled for leaning against a wall. Commander Thraction approached with the measured gait of someone delivering either very good news or very bad news. His mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement as he settled into a nearby chair, designed for something with entirely too many joints. "Miss Chun," he began, "we need to discuss what happened in the arena. Is Zarin going to be okay? I didn't mean to hurt him that badly. He'll recover. Karathi medical technology is quite advanced, though he'll require several weeks of regenerative therapy." The commander paused, studying her expression with his compound eyes. "The question is whether you used excessive force." Sarah blinked. "Excessive force?" He grabbed my throat. "Yes, we've reviewed the recording. Mr. Korath clearly initiated inappropriate physical contact. Then I responded appropriately. Basic defensive grappling, redirect the attacker's momentum. Control their center of gravity. Apply leverage at the weakest structural point." Weakest structural point? Sure, Karathi bone structure is beautiful, but it's optimized for energy distribution, not impact resistance. The collarbone joint is particularly vulnerable because it has to balance flexibility with load-bearing capacity. Commander Thraction's mandibles clicked faster. "You analyzed his skeletal structure during combat?" "Not consciously. It's just basic anatomy. You learn to read bone density and joint flexibility when you're training in mixed species environments." Mixed species environments? Sarah shrugged. "Earth's got a lot of biodiversity. You learn to adapt your techniques depending on whether you're dealing with something built like a gorilla or something built like a deer." The implications of this casual statement were staggering. Commander Thraction had spent decades studying military tactics from across the galaxy, and the idea that human combat training routinely included adaptive techniques for multiple body types suggested a level of versatility that most species never encountered. "Miss Chun," he said carefully, "exactly how much restraint were you using during the match? All of it? I mean, this was supposed to be a demonstration bout, right? I was trying not to hurt anybody. Are you telling me that you deliberately held back during the tournament?" "Well, yeah. I'm not here to injure people, just to learn. Besides, Zarin's techniques were actually pretty interesting from a physics standpoint." Over the following weeks, word of the tournament spread throughout the academy and beyond. Military recruiters who had initially dismissed human applicants began requesting detailed reports on Deathworlder training methodologies. Academic institutions started developing exchange programs with Terran military academies. Most significantly, the academy's curriculum began incorporating what they tactfully called adaptive combat principles.